Hi folks, Chase here. We are going to discuss Adam Smith today in lieu of some of Hubbard's stuff at the end of chapter 2. You still need to know Hubbard, and you need to know what he's getting at in terms of what a market needs at the end of chapter 2. But I think that this will actually give you a little bit richer discussion. So we're going to discuss Adam Smith, and specifically, we're going to talk about his work in The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations is usually thought about as sort of a seminal sort of starting or founding work in economics. That's probably a little overblown, but it's definitely important and is going to be useful for us describing how a market functions. So let's get started. There's a famous theorist by the name of Robert Heilbroner, and he thought that you could look at Smith's Wealth of Nations as essentially a work trying to answer two basic questions. How can a market society actually cohere and promote growth? If you'll recall from our chapter 1, every society has to figure out a solution to how to organize socially. We were calling those economies, and they were able to form up in a traditional fashion, a command fashion, or a market fashion. Smith's work is really an answer about how a market can deliver on these two things without having to rely on tradition or command. Okay, so let's start out on the first of those goals, coherence. Coherence is actually hugely important because if we choose a solution for organizing socially that fails, society basically comes apart, and that's not much of a solution at that point. So Smith needed to answer how a market society actually would not fall apart. And that probably seems a little overblown, but he's got to explain how a society is going to hold together without tradition or command, which are the obvious kinds of ways that you might expect a society to cohere. He thought that this was going to happen when people started looking out for their own self-interest and were forced into competition with each other. These two things taken together are the invisible hand. And he thought that these things were also going to be essentially a self-regulating mechanism. You didn't really need to worry about anything. They would kind of take care of themselves. And we'll notice that this is a very, very attractive feature, particularly for conservatives when they talk about markets. So how's this going to function? Imagine that you've got a consultant and they come in and they're going to discuss with a tribe how in fact the tribe might improve on their economics or their solution to those three classic questions. Imagine if they came in and what they gave to the tribe as advice was, tomorrow no one has to obey any commands or social traditions. You essentially can do whatever you want and things are going to be great. Now, you might imagine that, village leaders or even just common folks would look at them and probably think they're crazy. It just doesn't seem as though this is good advice. It sort of seems like, well, we're not going to have a plan and that's our plan. It's not apparent to people why this actually will function. Smith thought that you didn't need to really worry about some of the basics, like would you have a house or would you have food. He thought that people naturally were going to want to look out for themselves. This self-interest is a big deal here. If you let everyone do whatever they wanted, they were not going to go hang out at the beach and not grow food and not do their normal sort of tasks, because that would of course lead to starvation and without a house and all of these other nasty effects. So let's take sort of a worst case scenario and assume that everyone is stupid and goes to the beach rather than does anything at all. After a few weeks, you're probably running short on food. The first person who's smart enough to recognize this is going to start hopefully catching some fish or harvesting some crops, picking some fruit. They're going to be able to start to sell those. And if they start selling those things, uh, they're going to be able to make quite a bit of money because no one has any food. They're the only one who has it. And as you might imagine, they're going to be able to charge very, very high prices for that. And this is, of course, the other classic worry that pops up. If you do not have these social obligations between people and you have to buy everything from other folks, then there's the worry about price gouging. And Smith said that you didn't really need to worry about price gouging or monopoly because people were going to get forced into competing against each other. And this is the second piece of our self-regulating mechanism. Once you have someone who's selling fish for very, very high prices, the market is essentially sending out a cue that fish are valuable, people are willing to pay for them. More and more people are going to get into fish production, and as more and more people get into fish production, there's going to be more supply out there, and the price of those fish is going to start to come down. Okay. Similarly, you might have other things that pop up, like if no one's been tending their roofs, you might have a thatcher that starts to make quite a bit of money. And as he makes money, he will attract other people into his industry because people realize there's money in fixing up roofs. And all in all, people looking out for themselves and being forced to compete with each other is pretty much going to give you some nice outcomes. It's going to, one, basically tell you that wants and needs are generally going to be fulfilled. Two, prices tend to be a self-regulating mechanism, right? High prices cure themselves as they attract more resources and bump up production. And three, Smith really thought that incomes would be fairly balanced across groups. So anyone who was involved in one industry would probably end up making similar wages to folks in other industries. Because of course, if the person who was in fishing made lots more money than the person in roofing, then people would leave roofing and go into fishing. And as more and more people fished, and there were more fish available, prices would fall and incomes would fall. On the flip side, over in the roofing or the thatching industry, if you had less and less people there, there would be less competition. And with less competition and supply, you would get higher prices. And you would eventually see rising incomes as fishing incomes fell. So Smith thought that this was a product really for getting people what they needed, more or less, not having anyone have too much power or price gouging ability. And lastly, he thought that this was a recipe for balance. He was probably talking about capitalists making similar rates of return. He definitely still had a class orientation, despite the modern spin that Smith usually makes. So anyways, this is Smith's invisible hand. This is why he thought that you could generally let people kind of get out there and do what they were going to do, and via competition, they would regulate each other.